Anyone know what that is? Cyclone. Anyone know which cyclone that is? Katrina. It's pretty good. You can recognise cyclones. Well done. So it is Cyclone Katrina. And I remember what year that was. Make you feel old. 2005. Who are the cyclone nerds here? That's you? Yeah. Okay. Hurricane Katrina. Sorry, yes. So I get it right. 13 years ago, Hurricane Katrina. So following that cyclone or hurricane, a body of work emerged on the human disaster and not just the natural disaster. You may remember that the social and the human disaster was awful, it was catastrophic. 100,000 people were left in that city as much of the city fled. There was still 100,000 left, and they, of course, were the poor. Most were black. And you remember those horrific images as the choppers went over, you saw bodies floating in the flooded streets. You remember that convention centre where thousands were trapped inside that convention centre, and stories ran of gangs running that centre, and the violence and the rapes and so on. There was little food, there was no sanitation, and there was looting. And so that hurricane didn't just expose that. You remember the flood levees were built like a metre too low just to save a few bucks, and didn't just expose that was a dumb decision. Exposed the race and the class issue that had been prevalent in that city for centuries. It exposed what the academics called and label the slave mentality. The slave mentality is this: it's the emotional mindset of some people embedded generation after generation that says, I am poor, not rich. I'm weak, not strong. I'm dependent, not independent. I'm helpless, not self-sufficient. I'm a slave, not a master. And because of this plea, well, then I need help. I'm in fact depending on you. I can't do this alone. Or as one academic said, as if noblesse oblige were a blessing instead of an insult. How's your French? Does anyone know what noblesse oblige means? Or can have a guess at it? That's it. Are you fluent in French? Just brainy? Good guesser. Yeah, okay. That's it. So it's the obligation of the nobles. In fact, it's us, right? It's the obligation of our class to look after the people who need our help, the helpless, the disadvantaged. But it's as though the disadvantaged people see that their situation as a blessing instead of an insult. For us, it feels often awkward or difficult for us to take from others when people look to us and offer us charity because of our social background, because of who we are. Society generally says, it's not necessarily a blessing to be someone who's receiving handouts. But there was a whole class in that city, a whole class in all sorts of places that see it in completely the opposite way. It's as if the obligation of the nobles to give them stuff is a blessing and not a curse. Now, American slavery commenced in 1619 and it was all over by 1865. So that's only 246 years of slavery. And despite it only being 246 years, and despite it being over in 1865, the social impact is still evident today. And the mindset has a classification and a body of academic writings of its own. And so the very recent historical experience of slavery in the USA clearly identifies psychological and social consequences of slavery on not just the slaves. We're not just talking about people from 1865. There's some consequential impacts down through the generations, right down to 2005. Now, there's some notable features of this slave mentality, some attitudes and behaviours that separate the slave from the free. So we just want to look through these four particular features, and I guess in a way try and identify those attitudes of the slave and maybe just juxtapose them against our attitudes towards the same idea. So how do we, as the free, how do we think about work generally? How do you feel about work, guys? Fun, interesting. I need your job. You're the boss. Okay, you like your boss? Never disagree with your boss. Your own boss. Very good. I mean, sure, Monday morning it's a drag, right? And it's hard to get out of bed and go to work. But ultimately, work does what for us as the free? What does it do for us? Gives you an identity, gives you something to do, gives you a sense of self, it gives you money, it gives you freedoms. Now, when we, the free, think about work, I mean, what happens when a couple of guys just get together in a corner after the meeting? What's kind of the first thing one guy says to the other guy? How's work? Like, it sort of becomes this kind of thing it's as you say, it's about our identity, and I don't know what chicks do when they get together. Wish they'd invite me to talk to them, but anyway. No. But that, this becomes something that becomes who we are. But how do you think the slave feels about work? What's their attitude towards work? Absolutely. It's got to be despised, hasn't it? We see it as a way for self-fulfillment, a way for opportunity. For the slave, it's despised. It's actually seen as a punishment. It's a hated activity. And of course, the result is you become over-dependent upon welfare. If you can't go out and get your own job and make something of yourself, if you are just a slave, then you are always dependent. You hate the thing you do, and you're always dependent upon the welfare of the owner. So as we go through these things, I just want you to think about, obviously we're heading towards thinking about the children of Israel and 400 years of slavery. Just think about this, how this mentality, you may see it play out in their actions as well. So what do we think about, we, the free, about property? What does society think about property? That's right. It's a symbol of status, isn't it? So get property, get more of it. The richest people have the most amount of it. And you're right, it's a thing to get. The person with land, materials and objects is associated with power and status, and society often honours that person. What do you think the slave thinks about property? They have no access to it, right? They've got no access to it at all. Of course, there would be jealousy and hatred of the master who owns it. And I think also, there'd be this envy. So there'd be hatred, and yet at the same time, envy when it comes to the slave. Now, we, the free, how do we kind of feel about ourselves? How can we feel about ourselves? I don't need too many confessions right now, but we have the opportunity as the free to make something of ourselves, don't we? We have the opportunity to have sort of a confident, bold approach to life, to not have a sense of inferiority because it's all there for us. We have so much opportunity to become something. We are confident and self-determined. The slave, they're ruled by fear, less by friendship, so not a lot of friendship, a sense of inferiority and low self-esteem. The other little thing I thought was interesting when it came to the writings about the mental attitude of slaves was the way that community division was used to control slaves back in the day in America. So how is it that, a small white family on a cotton farm with hundreds of slaves, black, strong slaves, could stay in control in that environment? How could they control dozens of people? How was there not rebellion? And so there was an active process whereby slave masters were taught to make sure that there was division within the slaves, that you would actually break down the ability of them to rise up in rebellion, divide. And so you had the indoor slave, the outdoor slave, the slave that controlled the other slaves. And so just by breaking them down and creating division, it resulted in this deep entrenched predisposition to accept division even within the slaves. So though they had this common plight, there was this division that was accepted within them. And I think these are relevant observations, relatively recent history, when we think of the behaviour of the congregation in the wilderness. In the 1800s, Rabbi Dr. Marcus Lehman offers a description of this phenomenon. He writes this about Israel. He says, "It is a historical fact that slavery produces a slave mentality. The slave still remains a slave when his shackles are finally sundered. Even if the Israelites had been freed from the servile yoke of Pharaoh and Egypt by some political upheaval, they would have long since lost the capability of becoming a free and noble nation. Therefore, the Haggadah rightly says that if God had not freed us, then we and our children and our children's children would still have to bear the servile yoke of Pharaoh, even when Pharaoh and Egypt had long ceased to exist." So he says, this is a problem. There's a slave mentality. This isn't just a thing in the States in relatively recent history. If God hadn't have freed them, even if Egypt and Pharaoh had passed away, this slave mentality would impact their children and their children's children in an ongoing way. So when we come to the catalogue of wilderness complaints, their cries, their reminiscings, their lawlessness, their self-indulgence, their fickleness, they drive you mad when you read the scriptures. We must be mindful of their personal context. They are recently freed slaves. Some 400 years of displacement and slavery runs deep in their veins. And we know from early Exodus that some 80 years of hard slavery is their most recent experience. And because of that, I think we should be cautious not to oversimplify or underappreciate their responses in the wilderness. Their context is relevant. So just think about it. In the absence of a leader who goes up a mountain for 40 days, you don't know if he's dead, gone, coming back or whatever, what would the slave do? They would soon become directionless. They have no history of being self-fulfilling. It's a character trait of the free slave that to not have the ability to lead for themselves. I mean, I would suggest for us it would be different. I would suggest for us, because of our freed cultural background, we would think about how we would respond. We would not be directionless. We would appoint a leader. We would have a committee. We would work it out somehow. Or how about if food and water was suddenly denied us? I mean, think about the slave. They've spent their entire lives just getting the handout of food and water. Naturally, when it stops, they don't seek another source, they just grumble. I would suggest we may, as the free, choose to try and do something else. We'd probably elect Steve as our boss of hydroponics and organics and try and work out how to sort of work out, how would we get food and water, and Steve would suddenly become our champion. You up for it? Yeah. So we just need to kind of tune in and realise that there's a different mentality between the free and the slave. So I have no doubt that the congregation are representative of each and every one of us, that en masse, like us, they're sinful, they need a mediator and they're awaiting the promised land. There's no doubt. But I don't want us to lose sight of the nuances of their actions in relation to their social and historical background, because these people, they needed to be developed from the ground up. They needed leadership. They needed to relearn how to be servants of God and no longer slaves. They needed to learn how to do that. These people had no boundaries or guidance really on how to behave, no legal guidelines. And so whichever way you look at it, when you look at that group of people, Moses' relationship with them was always going to be a challenge. It was always going to be tough. And so I don't want to be too critical, because I'll be critical of myself, but I think it's a little sloppy Bible study, maybe that's saying it too strongly, just to sort of say, oh yeah, like we're just like the Egyptians, the Israelites in the wilderness. We would have done the exact same thing. I'm not quite sure if that's true. In fact, I think because of our social and historical background, we may have acted in a completely different way. Of course, we too are fickle people, but I don't know if that's the analogy, that we would just have done the exact same thing. We've got to be cognizant of their mindset. So if that's not the nexus between them and us, what is the nexus? How are we like them? What's the story of that congregation that helps us understand what to learn from them? If it's not that we would have done the exact same thing, then what's the purpose of trying to understand what they're like? And I've got a suggestion for that, and I'll give you that suggestion once I tell you a little story. Do you want to hear a story? Okay. So a couple of years ago, 5 or 6 years ago maybe, Michelle and I attended a weekend therapy workshop entitled Family Constellations. Michelle's got so many problems, I'll tell you about them later. Yeah, no, don't tell them mine, that's fine. This is a bit different, this kind of therapy. This is aimed at, the whole idea is reconciling things of the past and shifting generations of suffering. And that's kind of how it's relative to the slavery of through generations. And the way that things happen things that have happened through generations create issues later on, or unhappiness. So the therapy just doesn't focus on an individual, like in sort of not stereotypical, the usual way where you sit down with a psychologist and it's sort of one-on-one on the couch and all that sort of thing. This looks at, in a group, how people are an integral part of a system, and usually that's a system within a family. And so that's the idea of a family constellation, to look at how things work through generations. And it was conducted, there's about 25 people in the room, and it was a very tough weekend. It was harrowing. We got to hear a lot about people and their family backgrounds. And the thing that really affected me over that weekend was that every single person in attendance was impacted significantly by their family's history. And I guess in particular, every single family had a history with challenges. Every single family that was represented on that day was impacted by at least one of the following things: mental health issues, abuse, premature death, violence, suicide, addictions, or loss of a child. Every single family had one or more of those things. And I want to be sensitive to you guys. I don't want to talk about that and trample over your stuff. I don't want to dredge that up. But just to kind of just state that this seemed to be a common thing that every family, and it was really had these issues. It was a harrowing to hear these stories and the grief that echoed through generations. And so, I know that you probably all have some affinity with some of those things in your families. And it impacts on us. Some people barely perceive it, some carry it every single day of their lives. I mean, my family, in just a very short period of time, we've got alcoholism, mental health issues, abandonment and suicide. That's just my generation, my father and my grandfather. Those things in just that very small window in our family: alcoholism, mental health issues, abandonment and suicide, just in 3 generations. And I can see how that echoes and affects even me today. I can see how those issues have been a part of my childhood, part of our family structure, our family kind of thinking and feeling. And it echoes and it reverberates and it shapes. And so the spiritual analogy that I took from that weekend, coming to the point of this story, was that just like tragedy echoes down through the generations and shapes people, we too have a history of mortality and sin proneness and fickleness that is us. We have this kind of, also this thing that reverberates through the generations, that shapes us, that makes us who we are. We have our own intergenerational burden as well. It's a different kind of history of slavery. It's a slavery to sin. And so the point is that the Israelite was burdened by the slave mentality, and what that meant is that they needed to move from a slave and transition to a servant of God. And I think that's the key point that we need to kind of take when we look at the children of Israel. Not that we would have done the same thing, but it's the same process from slavery to something, and it's the transition is the thing. The transition to the rest, to freedom, to a nation, to servants of God. That's what we're supposed to focus on, because we all have our own intergenerational burdens and things that we need to transition out of into our rest, into our service, into becoming something in Christ. And Paul's like all over this idea of transition. Colossians 3, put off the old man with his deeds and put on the new man, which is renewed in knowledge after the image of him that created him. It's all about transition, from old to new. Ephesians 4, put off the former conversation, the old man, which is corrupt according to deceitful lusts, and be renewed in the spirit of your mind. Put on the new man, which after God is created in righteousness and true holiness. Transition. Romans 6, the old man's crucified, the body of sin is destroyed. Live with Christ, be alive to God. And so I think that's our connection to the Israelite in the wilderness. Not that we would just necessarily do the same thing. I think that may be a fallacy. Our connection is that we need to transition as well to a rest as much as they needed to transition to a rest. And I think it's interesting because Moses, of course, didn't share that background, but he did share in that same need for transition, didn't he? I mean, we've seen that already. He needed to go out into Moab to go from being having the ability to murder an Egyptian to then go and spend some time in Moab all those years, come to understand who God is, and transition to becoming the leader. So though he did not share the same issues or same background as his nation, he certainly shared the same experience of the need to transition. So, with that as a background, I'd like us to read some words about this congregation, because they are infuriating. There is no doubt about it, and I don't say that from a position of any arrogance. I too am infuriating and fickle, as I know you two are fickle as well. But they are infuriating when we read it. Psalm 106, and we're going to read verses 6 to 27 together. Thanks, Ruth. Psalm 106, starting at verse 6.
Reading from the ESV. Both we and our fathers have sinned. We have committed iniquity. We have done wickedness. Our fathers, when they were in Egypt, did not consider your wondrous works. They did not remember the abundance of your steadfast love, but rebelled by the sea, at the Red Sea. Yet he saved them for his name's sake, that he might make known his mighty power. He rebuked the Red Sea, and it became dry, and he led them through the deep as through a desert. So he saved them from the hand of the foe and redeemed them from the power of the enemy. And the waters covered their adversaries, not one of them was left. Then they believed his words, and they sang his praise. But they soon forgot his works. They did not wait for his counsel. But they had a wanton craving in the wilderness and put God to the test in the desert. He gave them what they asked, but sent a wasting disease among them. When men in the camp were jealous of Moses and Aaron, the Holy One of the Lord, the earth opened and swallowed up Dathan and covered the company of Abiram. Fire also broke out in their company, and flame burned up the wicked. They made a calf in Horeb and worshipped a metal image. They exchanged the glory of God for an image of an ox that eats grass. They forgot God, their Saviour, who had done great things in Egypt, wondrous works in the land of Ham, and awesome deeds by the Red Sea. Therefore, he said he would destroy them, had not Moses, his chosen one, stood in the breach before him to turn away his wrath from destroying them. Then they despised the pleasant land, having no faith in his promise. They murmured in their tents and did not obey the voice of the Lord. Therefore he raised his hand and swore to them that he would make them fall in the wilderness and would make their offspring fall among the nations, scattered them among the lands.
Thanks, Ruth. I mean, how did Moses put up with them? And that's not even the end of it. Like, it goes on there, it talks about the issue of Baal Peor and Meribah and so on. It just goes on and on and on. How did he put up with them? How did he love them? Let's just quickly go through this catalogue of infuriating things that these people did. 3 days after their delivery from Egypt, so Exodus 14, a sea splits in two, a nation walks through it, unbelievable things happen. 3 days later, they're grumbling, what shall we drink? The next chapter, in Exodus 16, they again grumble against Moses and Aaron and seek food. The next chapter, the congregation quarrel with Moses and demand water. And for the first time, they leave Egypt in Exodus 14, a sea splits in two. By Exodus 17, there's maybe suggesting it wasn't such a good thing that we left Egypt. That, it was a bad decision. Exodus 18, the congregation crowd around Moses to judge them and to resolve their disputes. It's an interesting one. Remember we talked about that in America they used division to keep control of the group. It's interesting that early on, in Exodus 18, very early on, they're all fighting amongst themselves, so much so that Moses needs to set up a system whereby he's resolving their disputes. In Exodus 20, the congregation don't even want to hear God's voice. They want to stand back and get back from God. The congregation, it says after Moses delayed in the mountain, they demand Aaron to make another god. The golden calf incident results. The congregation then leaves Sinai and they grumble about their misfortunes. I mean, the things that they saw and witnessed and that happened in Sinai were amazing. And then they grumble about their misfortunes. In Numbers 11, they weep about the food that they once ate in Egypt. Every man at his door, at his tent, crying. So there's like however many it was, hundreds of thousands, millions of people at their tent doors crying. God provides quails. Miriam and Aaron then, can you believe it? Miriam and Aaron then cross Moses and speak against him. The spies return and the congregation again, guess what? They're crying. It says they wept all night, wishing they had died in the wilderness, wishing they could go back to Egypt, and even suggesting that they needed a new leader. Inexplicably, I say, okay, we better stone Moses, Joshua, and Caleb. Like, how did that even become an idea in their heads? And then God says, well, because of that, you're not going up to enter the land. That's it. That's not happening. And then they mourn again, and they get up in the morning and they say, actually, God, we've changed our minds. And he says, no, don't go up. And they say, no, we've changed our minds. We're going up. And they go up, and God says, don't transgress. Moses says, don't transgress God. And that's when the Amalekites and the Canaanites attack them. All that catalogue of just over and over and over again, there's a 40-year period. The bits that I've just spoken about, does anyone know how long that we've just spoken about, all those events, what period of those 40 years that's talking about? Just the first 2 years of the 40. That all happens in just the first 2 years of the most miraculous escape of the Old Testament of this from Egypt, with a sea split in two. And it's interesting, the next 38 years is actually fairly silent in the record. There's sort of scant details, but the details that we have, again, the congregation is behaving pretty poorly. There's the rebellion of Korah, Dathan and Abiram. They argue with Moses and wish for Egypt and demand water at Meribah. Soon after Aaron's death, the congregation again speaks against God and Moses, and that's the plague of the fiery serpents. And then there's that moment with the daughters of Moab. How is it that Moses stays powerfully connected to those people? How did he put up with them? How did he love them? And it's true that at times he is exasperated with them. There is no doubt about that. That comes through very clearly in the record. On one occasion, even wishing for death. but in the main he is passionately connected to the congregation. How? In the face of that fickleness. And to me, that's the key question when it comes to understanding the relationship between Moses and the congregation. How and why did he love them? And I've got two suggestions. And the first is a fairly simple one. We can't ever forget that this is the nation that kept the Passover, that by faith crossed the Red Sea. Hebrews 11, it's the only faithful action that talks about a whole nation. Everything else is about individuals. Hebrews 11 says, by faith, this people, the congregation, crossed the Red Sea as on dry land, but the Egyptians, when they attempted to do the same, were drowned. And so Moses saw them believe in the impossible. Sea split in two, as we said, and just a whole nation walking through it, entirely trusting that God would keep that sea apart, by faith moving through it, trusting in his delivery. And so Moses, with his own two eyes, had witnessed their baptism. He had seen their faith and knows by experience their potential. He was a part of them. He was a part of those who, as it states in 1 Corinthians 10, "For I do not want you to be unaware, brothers, that our fathers were all under the cloud and all passed through the sea and all were baptised into Moses in the cloud and in the sea, and all ate the same spiritual food and all drank the same spiritual drink." He had seen them at their very best when they demonstrated their faith in action. So that's reason one, I think. But what about reason two? How did he stay connected to these people? And I think the answer is best distilled out of Exodus 32. For me, this is Moses' most crowning moment of his life. Fabulous insight into who he is and what drives him. Maybe second most crowning incident. We'll talk about the most tomorrow. As you know, in Exodus chapter 32, the children of Israel make a god out of gold in the shape of a cow. But worse than just that, they ascribe their delivery, that walking through the Red Sea, they ascribe their delivery to this cow god. They say in verse 8, "These are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt." Like, that's just unbelievable. That is just insolence and just unbelievable lack of faith, despite their faith in walking through the Red Sea. And as a result, God says this, and you can understand why he says it. He says to Moses, "I've seen this people, and behold, it's a stiff-necked people. Now therefore let me alone, that my wrath may burn hot against them, and I may consume them, in order that I may make a great nation of you." Now this is an incredible moment. Just, can you see what's being put on the table here? This is like a watershed moment for Moses. Moses is being offered to what? To be made a great nation. Any echoes there? To Abraham, Isaac and Jacob. What's the echo there? That's the promises to Abraham, Isaac and Jacob. God's saying, let me just put this on the table here, Moses, for you. Let's forget about these people. Let's just get rid of them. Let's reset. Let's start again. I know we've got promises that run through Abraham, Isaac and Jacob. I'm going to narrow that down even more now, and we're going to narrow this down to one person. We're going to narrow this down to you. I'm going to make this whole idea of my chosen people, the seed of the promise, the future seed who would deal with the serpent thinking. This is all going to come right now directly through you, Moses. Everyone else is gone. We're starting again. I'm going to make a great nation of you through. We can dispel, in a sense, push down the legacy of Abraham, Isaac and Jacob, and elevate you, because through you will come eventually the Son of God. That's tempting, a rewriting of the fathers. He'd be rid of that short-term burden of the nation and become himself a great nation. But it hardly even seems to register in his mind. Here's his response. He says, "But Moses implored the Lord his God and said, 'O Lord, why does your wrath burn hot against your people, whom you've brought out of the land of Egypt with great power and with a mighty hand? Why should the Egyptians say, with evil intent did he bring them out to kill them in the mountains and to consume them from the face of the earth? Turn from your burning anger and relent from this disaster against your people. Remember Abraham, Isaac and Israel, your servants, to whom you swore by your own self and said to them, I will multiply your offspring as the stars of heaven, and all this land that I have promised I will give to your offspring, and they shall inherit it forever.'" Completely absent from that answer is who? Moses. Like God says, let's just get rid of these people and start again with you. And there's only two parties that he's concerned about. It's God and the people. But he's completely absent from the response. And it's an insight here. We've got an insight into how Moses thinks. You see, Moses connects these two things. He connects God and the congregation. He sees God as part of them and them as part of God. They're inseparable in his mind. And this idea of God plus the people weaves throughout this record, throughout Exodus and Deuteronomy, and it just comes up over and over again. It's a dominant idea. God and the people. Exodus 3, that you may bring my people out of Egypt. This is kind of the whole idea. God and his people coming out of Egypt. Exodus 19, you are to me a kingdom of priests. That's what I think of you, people. You're a holy nation. Exodus 22, you shall be consecrated to me. Deuteronomy 14, you are a people holy to the Lord your God, and the Lord has chosen you to be a people for his treasured possession out of all the peoples who are on the face of the earth. Deuteronomy 28, the Lord will establish you as a people holy to himself. And in that wonderful song of Moses in Exodus 15, after they come through the Red Sea, Moses and his people sing together this. They all sing this. Moses pens it, and they sing, you have led in your steadfast love the people whom you have redeemed. And so we have this connection. God, Yahweh, his chesed, his steadfast love is directed to the people. These things are inseparable ideas. God loves the people. They're inseparable. It's steadfast love. How does he abide them? Well, he loves them. How does he put up with them? He just loves them. They're God's special people. They're holy. They're priests. They're consecrated. They're chosen. They're recipients of his chesed, his steadfast love. So he just connects God and the people, and he sees them just wrapped up as one thing. It's a signature characteristic of Moses. It's what makes him tick. It's how he can put up with them for 40 years in the wilderness. They're united in his mind. And so we can kind of just start to enter into his feelings, his heart, what drives him, his motivation. And I guess what cements this idea is that God notes it. And we're going to have a look at that in this little incident in Numbers chapter 12. This signature characteristic is not just important for us to observe, it's actually fundamental to God. So in Numbers 12, Miriam and Aaron rebel. It's always Moses and God, God and Moses. Well, what about us? It's Miriam and Aaron rebelling. And you may remember that when this rebellion occurs, God's not invited. God turns up in a cloud at the door of the tent. He just turns up. There's rebellion, and he turns up. And he turns up to perform a character witness of Moses. Can you imagine that? Just think about that for a moment. Think about you copying it somewhere, at work, with your family, you're out at a restaurant, someone's like giving you a hard time, they're having a go at you, having a crack at you, and God turns up as a character witness. This is no kind of ordinary moment. And God says this. He says, hear my words. If there is a prophet among you, Tell you what happens normally with a prophet. I, the Lord, make myself known to him in a vision. I speak with him in a dream. That's what normally happens. Visions and dreams for prophets. But let me tell you about Moses. Not so with my servant Moses. He is faithful in all my house. With him I speak mouth to mouth clearly, and not in riddles, and he beholds the form of God. So I don't deal with him like I deal with other prophets. My interactions transcend that when it comes to Moses. And he gives him a character witness. Now there's all sorts of things that God could have said of Moses. And he turns up to say, this is what I like about him. This is why he's important to me. He could have said he's a servant, he's a nursing father, he's a prophet, he's a deliverer, he's a leader, he's a judge. There's all sorts of things that he could have said, but he doesn't. He says, I'll tell you what's important about him. He's faithful with my people. That's what I'm interested in. He's connected me and the people, and he's faithful about that. His attitude matters to God. His attitude to the people is important to the Father. And this attitude of Moses is actually something that is picked up on in Hebrews. And I'm about to put up a slide that you should never put up because it looks like that. How bad's that? Too many words. I know you shouldn't put up too many words, but hang in there with me. This is what it says, because there's a point that's being made about this Numbers 12 incident. In Hebrews 3 it says, therefore, holy brothers, you who share in a heavenly calling, consider Jesus. So we know that Hebrews deals over and over again with how Jesus is more excellent than other things. The law and, help me out here, my mind's gone blank, tabernacle, so on. So all these things that Jesus is more excellent than. Consider Jesus the apostle and high priest of our confession, who was faithful to him who appointed him, just as Moses also was faithful in all God's house. For Jesus has been counted worthy of more glory than Moses, as much more glory as the builder of a house has more honour than the house itself. For every house is built by someone, but the builder of all things is God. Now Moses was faithful in all God's house as a servant. Clearly this is a reference to Numbers 12, to God's character witness of Moses. To testify to the things that were to be spoken later, but Christ is faithful over God's house as a son. And we are his house if indeed we hold fast our confidence and our boasting in our hope. And just remember, just figure out what the Hebrew writer is saying here. He's saying, I just want to compare you to show you that Jesus is more faithful over the house. And he doesn't choose Trevor. Say, look, Trevor's like Jesus is more faithful than Trevor, or he doesn't choose Susie. He has to put up with Trevor. So Susie's more faithful, or faithful. Doesn't put up with Ange. Has to put up with both of them. That's not the comparison here. Doesn't put the ecclesia up. Has to put up with the Hickses, right? That's not. I mean, that's all silly. He says, I'm going to give you the highest bar I can give when it comes to demonstrating how faithful Jesus is over the house. The highest bar isn't this kind of bar. The highest bar is there through the roof. It's when God turns up and says to Moses, you're faithful over my house. This is like you can't get a higher bar when it comes to how much more excellent Jesus is. That's the point that Hebrews chapter 3 is making. That despite this remarkable status of Moses, that's still inferior to the Lord Jesus Christ. So this idea that he is faithful to the congregation, that God notes it, is an important insight into who he is, and equally it's an important insight into who our Lord is. Okay, so as the kids say, are we nearly there yet? And the answer is yes. I'll just give us a quick summary of what we've done and then we'll conclude. The slave freed from Egypt is still burdened by the mentality of the slave. Free but not yet changed, they needed transition. And the result is faithlessness. And their faithfulness has a relationship with their social and historical background. That's what we kind of started with. Then we said, well, what about us? Well, yes, we too come from a deep history of fickleness and unfaithfulness. It's a different kind of slavery as our past. But like the Israelite, our hope, our task is to unburden ourselves of that and to transition to our rest. Then we considered the catalogue of the fickleness of that nation. We pondered how is it that Moses can remain connected to this congregation. We said, well, he'd seen them at their best. He'd seen them full of faith. He sees that God is connected to the people, that he loves them because God loves them. There's this thing that bound in his mind. Yahweh's hesed love for that congregation. And perhaps most remarkably, out of this we see that Moses' attitude to the congregation is really one of his crowning glories. God turns up and notes it himself. So as a little segue then to some concluding remarks. Moses' attitude to the congregation mattered. And I'd just like to make some commentary, therefore, about our attitude to the congregation. If it's true that it mattered to God how he thought about them, then what about us? And yeah, we should consider ourselves as the congregation of God, right? Our community. We should do that. We should aspire to be the house of God, the people of God. Hebrews 3 makes that clear. And it's my experience that there's been some shifting in places about our attitude to the Christadelphian community. And my sense is that there's kind of been a reaction. That's why there's sort of been a bit of an attitude shift. A reaction to the apparent arrogance of part of our community and the forthrightness of parts of our community that appear to profess that, we are the truth and appear to step into the shoes of God, and because of that start to set boundaries of God's forgiveness, God's grace and God's redemption. And so there's parts of our community, and maybe I've been there myself, that have been disparaging, judgmental and self-righteous. And so I think because of that either has existed historically or still may exist in some parts now, we see in our community a reaction to that. A reaction to that perceived self-righteousness and overt judgment of others. And so what I think we're seeing in reaction to that is some caution or maybe even resistance to being bold about our community, to being invested in our congregation, to having a positive attitude to us. And I appreciate that reaction. I'm concerned about self-righteousness and judgmental behaviour, but I do fear the knock-on effect of what our reaction can lead to, this kind of shift in attitude towards the Christadelphian community. And so in recent times I've kind of observed a more laissez-faire attitude amongst us about us. I'm a member of it, but yes, I'm kind of a bit laissez-faire about that. Kind of a removed and analytical approach to being a member of this community. It's almost like, to me, it seems like some people are sitting back and spending more time analysing, critiquing and making commentary on the community than stepping in and saying, I'm part of it and let's help fix it. I wonder if that resonates with some of you. That kind of, the stuff you see on net, that net commentary about our community, and you think, but hang on, here you are having a go at our community, but aren't you part of that community? That kind of removed critique of our community. And maybe a tendency for some of us to step in and out based on convenience of lifestyle. So it's a generalisation, I know. It's not a criticism. I don't know you well enough. I don't know where you're at with all that. But it's an observation. And it's not a criticism, as I say. And it's an attitude of which I've been guilty also. That the passionate commitment in voice, in energy and time, and the involvement in this Christadelphian community has diminished somewhat. And that's an attitudinal observation. And so if it's true that the attitude of Moses to the congregation matters, if it matters to God, then it's worth just pausing and reflecting on my attitude to the congregation. And I can't cajole you, I can't guilt you, don't intend to, into Moses' way of thinking or acting, but I think we can remind ourselves, we should remind ourselves that being passionate, being excited, being committed, having skin in the game, getting in and involved, putting ourselves out, supporting our people, loving this odd collection of, bunch of people, seeing God and Christ in us actually matters. We are his house. This is a remarkable idea that you are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation. That's just talking about us, God's own people, that you may declare the wonderful deeds of him who called you out of darkness into his marvellous light. So being part of this thing is never presented as something selective or part-time or inconsistent or subject to convenience. It's an idea that's involved and consumed and passionate. And Moses saw that God and the people were entwined, and his reaction to that is to love them and have skin in the game as well. It's etched in his DNA. God number one, congregation number two. And so you end up with this kind of triangular. Is it going to come up? It's there. It's going to come up in a minute. This triangular relationship, this idea of of course, you and I have a relationship with God. You and I do. But we know that God is equally passionate about the congregation. We know that. And what God notes of Moses, the thing that's amazing about Moses, is this element. God doesn't say, oh yeah, you and I are great, Moses. The reason his character witness of Moses is this part of the equation, how God feels about the people. And so this kind of triangular relationship is important to God. So it matters. It's determinative. It's worth doing something about it. Because one day, I just want to be just one of those dots amongst you. And I'm sure you just want to be one of those dots amongst us. That's the way this thing works. That's what we want. And I would say that starts now, with passion for God, with passion for God's people, and with skin in the game. Because God's temple is holy, and you are that temple.